Hey, I'm Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates. And if you find yourself watching this video, it means one of two things. Either you're curious what happens if your appraisal comes in below the purchase price, or your appraisal already did come in below the purchase price. Before we discuss the actual steps of handling a low appraisal, let's talk about the appraisal contingency. The primary place you'll see an appraisal contingency, at least in Washington State, is part of the financing addendum. In the financing addendum, there's typically a clause that discusses what happens in the event that the appraisal comes in below the purchase price. This clause spells out the process of how this is going to be handled. You'll also find that in a contract that doesn't have a financing contingency, you can other times put in an appraisal contingency. So sometimes in competitive situations, my clients elect to not include a financing contingency because they're so confident that their financing is going to be secured, or maybe they've already been pre-underwritten for their loan, but they'll still want to include this appraisal contingency to protect themselves in the event that the appraisal comes in low. And even further, there's another addendum that buyers will sometimes include in the purchase and sale agreement. And this is essentially an offer to increase the down payment if the appraisal comes in low. So in an attempt to offset the contingency, if it's competitive, again, buyers will sometimes include an offer of good faith, where they will say, if the appraisal comes in low, they will be willing to pay X amount additional down. So they will offer to maybe pay $5,000 or $10,000 or $30,000 or $50,000 down additional if the appraisal comes in below the purchase price. And again, this usually happens in competitive situations. It doesn't happen in a normal buyer and seller negotiation if it's not competitive. Maybe it's a buyer's market and the seller doesn't have as much leverage from other buyers. And so that's where you would see maybe a financing contingency with that appraisal contingency included. But in the competitive situations, sometimes you see just the appraisal contingency, and you might see this offer of additional down payment. We've talked about the appraisal contingency. Now, what the heck is an appraisal? If you're a first-time buyer and you haven't purchased before, you're probably wondering what an appraisal is. And an appraisal is essentially a third-party valuation for the bank. And it's also for your benefit, but the bank wants to make sure that they're making a good investment. So they're gonna have a third party come out, assess the property. It's a very light inspection, if you even wanna call it an inspection. And then they go back and they look at recent sales in the area that are similar to the subject property, the house that you're purchasing, and they're providing information to the bank and to you that shares whether they believe that the purchase price is justified by the recent sales or if it's not. If the purchase price is justified or even exceeded by the appraisal, we're good to go. The transaction proceeds, there are no issues, no questions asked. If the appraisal comes in below the purchase price, that's where we have to talk about the next steps. If the appraisal comes in below the purchase price, the first step is for the buyer to present a copy of the appraisal and also a notice of low appraisal. And this is delivered to the seller. And essentially the ball is put in the seller's court. The seller then has a few different options. The seller can either hire the same appraiser or a different appraiser to essentially provide a new appraisal, and this appraisal needs to meet the purchase price. So if they can provide a reappraisal that matches the purchase price and the buyer's okay with that, the transaction can proceed and we can move forward. The seller can also reduce the purchase price down to the appraised value, and the transaction will continue as normal. If the seller doesn't want to reduce the purchase price down to the appraised value, maybe it's a really large amount, or maybe they just don't want to, the seller can opt to reduce the purchase price or offer to reduce the purchase price to a specific point. And then at that point, the buyer would need to make up the difference in the low appraisal. Now, in this instance, the buyer is not obligated to contribute additional funds or agree to that reduced price, but not fully reduced price. And in that case, the buyer would need to also agree to bring additional funds to closing. The seller's final option, last option, if the appraisal comes in low, is to outright reject the buyer's notice of low appraisal. And in this case, the buyer then has the ball back in their court and has to make a decision if they want to proceed with the purchase, bringing additional funds, or if they want to back out. One note during this initial negotiation phase, if the seller does agree to reduce the purchase price down to the appraised value, the buyer is obligated to continue with the purchase. It's not an opportunity for the buyer to back out. But if the seller doesn't consent to reducing the purchase price and opts to go with one of these other routes, specifically option number 3 or 4, where they partially reduce the price or reject the reduced price outright, the buyer then has a decision to make. We just went over the process of handling the low appraisal. What are the steps in negotiating that low appraisal? Practically speaking, sometimes the seller will decide to not reduce the price, and the buyer then would come back and say, all right, well, in that case, we're gonna need to back out. We can't do it. And the seller then could reconsider, and there's still an opportunity to come to an agreement. So I don't want anyone to watch this video and think it's a final response because there are opportunities to make it happen. I've seen deals fall apart over $1,000 or $2,000 low appraisal, and the seller didn't want to budge and would rather put the house back on the market. Me personally, I think that's crazy, and it's a long process to go all the way back through to find a new buyer, bring it back on the market, and go through this whole hoopla again. And who knows, the appraisal might come in low again. The most likely solution is usually the seller and the buyer meet somewhere in the middle on the low appraisal, because the buyer did agree to pay the purchase price and the seller wants to make the deal happen and wants to get the most money for their house. So if the buyer agreed to pay the purchase price, the seller's not usually wanting to drop the price to make the deal happen. But if they want the deal to go through and they don't want to go through the hassle of finding a new buyer, they got to make it work. Does the appraised value for a property typically come in below the purchase price? Not really, but I think it's important for you as a buyer or a seller to know what this process looks like for handling the situation, and if it comes, be prepared for it. Thank you so much for watching this video on how to handle a low appraisal. If you have questions, type them down in the comments below, and if you want to see other content like this, please subscribe to my channel.